The cell was quiet except for the faint scratching of pencil on paper. Private Kenji Nakamura sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, thin as a shadow, his ribs pressing against skin mottled by fever. Outside, the monsoon winds clawed at the tin roof of the British-run camp in Burma. When the guards entered after dawn to collect his belongings, they found something strange, a single, battered notebook. Every page filled with one word. One name, Emiko, hundreds of times, written until the pencil broke, until his shaking hands could no longer move. Who was she? A lover? A spy? A code name? In that forgotten corner of a crumbling empire, a condemned man's obsession blurred the line between loyalty and love, between sanity and surrender. What the guards didn't know was that the name on those pages would travel farther than any soldier in the war and uncover a truth Japan never wanted the world to see. This is not a story about generals or glory. It's about a single man, a forbidden name, and a quiet rebellion of memory in the face of death. The jungle didn't whisper. It screamed. By late 1944, the once proud Imperial Japanese Army in Burma was collapsing. Jungle rot ate through boots and skin alike. Maggots crawled through bandages. Soldiers gnawed on leaves when the rice ran out. Among them marched Private Kenji Nakamura, 26 years old, a clerk-turned-soldier, dragging what remained of his unit through a green hell. He had once believed Japan's empire was unbreakable. That belief was dying faster than the men around him. Orders were clear. Do not surrender. Die with honor. But what is honor when your captain's body is half buried in mud, and your best friend's corpse lies beside a rusted helmet? For Kenji, survival itself had become treason. When the British counterattacked near the Irrawaddy River, his unit shattered. Men fled into the jungle, chased by gunfire and disease. Kenji crawled into a swamp, clutching a small notebook sealed in oil paper, his last connection to a life before uniform and obedience. He had written one name in it, just one, Emiko. 3 days later, delirious from fever, he was found by a British patrol. He didn't fight. He didn't beg. He simply collapsed at their feet. The British didn't expect prisoners. The Japanese weren't supposed to surrender. Back in Tokyo, surrender meant shame, not only for the soldier, but for his family. The government erased POWs from records, calling them traitors to the emperor. Their families received no letters, no pensions, only silence. As Kenji awoke in a bamboo cage, his first instinct wasn't fear of the enemy, but of what his own country would think. Every lesson he'd been taught screamed inside him. You are less than human now. You do not deserve to live. But in that dark cage, as malaria shook his body and the sound of distant bombing rolled through the jungle, he reached for the notebook. His pencil moved weakly across the first page. Emiko. The name felt like oxygen. Every line of that single word pushed back against a lifetime of indoctrination. The belief that emotion was weakness, that surrender was sin. He didn't know it yet, but that word would become his survival instinct, a lifeline stronger than the empire itself. Weeks later, when British guards transferred the prisoners to a camp outside Rangoon, Kenji barely spoke. He obeyed every order, kept his head low, his eyes empty. But every night, under the flickering lamplight, he wrote. Sometimes he whispered as he wrote, as if speaking to her across oceans. I can't remember the sound of your voice anymore, but I remember your hands. No one around him knew who Emiko was. No one dared to ask. To them, he was just another broken soldier clinging to something invisible. But one British sergeant, a war-hardened man named Tom Harris, began to notice. That Jap's got something he won't let go of, Harris muttered to another guard. He's hiding something, and in a way he was. Not a secret of strategy or maps, but something far more dangerous in wartime. Love. Because love, in an empire built on obedience, was the ultimate act of defiance. What would drive a man to risk his life? Not for his emperor, but for a memory. And who was this woman whose name he couldn't stop writing, even as death closed in? Tokyo, 1939. The city glittered with banners of red and white. The rising sun emblazoned on every shop front. Loudspeakers crackled with patriotic marches. "Serve the Emperor! Die for Japan!" echoed through every street. But inside one narrow classroom, away from the propaganda, a quiet rebellion was blooming in the heart of a young teacher named Emiko Tanaka. She was 22, with ink-stained fingers and a stubborn softness that defied the world around her. Each morning, she led her students in the ritual bow to the emperor's portrait. Each evening, she stayed behind after the others had gone, erasing chalk dust from a board while air raid sirens wailed far away in China. War was an idea, then something distant, something heroic. That was before she met Kenji Nakamura. He was working as a supply clerk at the Ministry of Transport. Mild, polite, always carrying a book. They met one spring afternoon at the Yasukuni Shrine during the annual Cherry Blossom Festival. She dropped her notebook on the temple steps, and he picked it up. A simple act. But when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. A flicker of humanity untouched by ideology. For weeks after, they crossed paths by accident. On the tram, at the marketplace, at the same tea stall under the paper lanterns. Their conversations were cautious at first, but as months passed, they dared to speak freely. About music, about books banned by the censors, about dreams. She loved poetry. He loved how she read it aloud. But in 1940, as Japan plunged deeper into the war, words became dangerous. Love letters could be seized. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious behavior. Even whispering doubts about the war could mean interrogation. Still, Kenji wrote to her. Every week, folded in careful script, he sent letters hidden beneath official reports. One line stayed the same in every one. "When this madness ends, I'll take you to see the sea." But madness never ends on schedule. By 1941, conscription came for him, and like millions of others, he obeyed. Emiko watched as Kenji boarded the train, surrounded by flags and cheering crowds. He tried to smile, but his eyes betrayed him. He didn't believe in the slogans. He only believed in her. The last thing he said before the whistle blew was, "Don't forget me, even if they tell you to." Emiko kept that promise, but the war took everything from her. The government censored mail from the front. When she received letters, whole sentences were blacked out, just fragments left. "Still alive, the jungle, I dream of you." Then one day the letters stopped. Months turned into years. Tokyo darkened under the weight of war. Rations tightened. The city became a ghost of itself. By 1944, American bombers turned nights into firestorms. Emiko's school burned to ashes in a single raid. She survived by chance, hiding beneath a collapsed stairwell. When she crawled out, covered in soot and tears, she found a piece of chalk still clutched in her hand. That night, as planes droned overhead, she wrote his name on her wall, Kenji. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, inside a prisoner's cell in Burma, Kenji was writing hers, Emiko. 2 names, 2 souls, one written in ashes, the other in pencil. Neither knew the other was still alive, but both kept writing, as if the act itself could hold back the tide of destruction. For Emiko, it was hope. For Kenji, it was defiance. Back in Tokyo, the government's grip tightened. The secret police, the captivity, began rounding up anyone suspected of defeatism. One afternoon, they came for her. Someone had reported that she'd been seen crying during a military parade. They called it unpatriotic behavior. She was interrogated for hours, her hands trembling as officers demanded to know who she was writing to, why she kept foreign books, why her letters had no patriotic slogans. But she gave them nothing. When they released her days later, bruised and hollow-eyed, she went home and burned every photograph of Kenji she had left, except one. That night, she placed that single photo inside her notebook and whispered, "If you're alive, remember me." And somehow, against all odds, he did. Because in that Burmese camp, surrounded by disease and death, Kenji wrote her name as if it were the last word left in his world. Every letter of Emiko was an act of resistance, a refusal to become what the war wanted him to be, empty, obedient, forgotten. He didn't know if she was alive. He didn't even know if Japan still stood. But in the half-light of the camp barracks, he kept writing. Because when a man loses his country, his pride, his purpose, all that remains is memory. And for Kenji Nakamura, memory had a name. The camp smelled of rust and rot. Sweat, smoke, and sickness hung heavy in the air. Rows of barbed wire cut across the dusty plains of Burma, slicing the horizon into a cage. Inside that cage, hundreds of men, Japanese, Korean, Formosan conscripts, moved like shadows under the unrelenting sun. They were the forgotten army of a fallen empire. Private Kenji Nakamura had stopped counting the days. Somewhere between the fever dreams and the interrogations, time had dissolved into a blur of heat and hunger. Every morning began with the same sound, the clang of tin cups, the barking of orders in broken English, the shuffling of bare feet toward another day that refused to end. The British guards weren't cruel by instinct. Some were tired boys themselves, men who had seen too much death to feel anything anymore. But hatred ran deep in the camp, a silent current just beneath every glance. The newspapers called Japanese soldiers fanatics. Few bothered to imagine them as human. Kenji learned English slowly. Water. Work. Move. No, the words came in fragments, stitched together by necessity. But when he spoke, it wasn't words that kept him alive. It was silence. Silence and the notebook. He guarded it more fiercely than food. Folded in cloth, tucked into the lining of his uniform, it became his entire world. When disease gnawed at his body and his cellmates coughed blood into rags, he wrote the same 5 letters again and again. EMIKO. Sometimes he pressed too hard, the pencil tip breaking. Other times the letters were faint, trembling, like the last echo of a man trying not to disappear. His cellmate, Sergeant Tanabe, once asked him, "What's that name you keep writing?" Kenji didn't answer. Tanabe just nodded. "Whoever she is, she's keeping you alive." And in a way, she was. Every day, men vanished, taken out for questioning, never seen again. Some collapsed at work and were buried in shallow graves behind the wire. The guards stopped learning their names. But Kenji's ritual, the writing, became his heartbeat. Then one afternoon, during a routine inspection, everything changed. A British interpreter, Lieutenant Mark Lister, was ordered to examine personal belongings. When he reached Kenji's bed, he lifted the thin mattress and found it, the notebook. Flipping through, he frowned. Every page filled with the same name, written hundreds of times. "Who's Emiko?" he asked sharply. Kenji froze. Lister's eyes narrowed. "Is this a code book?" The notebook was confiscated, and within hours, the entire camp buzzed with rumor. Some said the Japanese had devised a secret cipher, that Emiko meant something military, something dangerous. For Kenji, it was a nightmare. The one thing that tethered him to his humanity was now labeled treason. That night, he lay awake listening to the monsoon rain hammer the tin roof. He whispered her name under his breath, over and over, as if the storm might carry it to her. Emiko! Emiko! He didn't sleep. Days later, he was summoned to the command tent for interrogation. Lieutenant Lister sat behind a wooden table, the notebook open before him. "You expect me to believe this isn't a code?" Lister said, slamming his palm against the paper. Kenji's throat tightened. He searched for words, any English that could explain, but all that came out was no code. "Name woman." Lister's eyes softened for a moment. "A woman." Kenji nodded weakly. "Tokyo." The room fell silent. Outside, rain drummed against canvas. Lister glanced again at the notebook, at the hundreds of identical names written by a starving man who had nothing else. Slowly, he closed it. "Take him back," he muttered. Kenji wasn't punished that day, but from then on, the guards watched him differently, half suspicion, half pity. He became a ghost moving between suspicion and mercy. Weeks passed. The fever came again, and this time it didn't let go. Delirious, he mumbled Emiko's name aloud. Other prisoners whispered that he was losing his mind. Some envied him for it. At least he had something left to cling to. And still, the world outside kept changing. Rumors crept through the camp fences. Japan was losing. Tokyo was burning. The emperor's voice had been heard on the radio, a voice no Japanese soldier was ever supposed to hear. Could it be true? Could the war really be ending? But for Kenji, there was no ending. Only the echo of a promise made years ago under cherry blossoms. When this madness ends, I'll take you to see the sea. He had no sea, no home, no letters. Only her name. And soon, that name, his final rebellion, would be the very thing that sealed his fate. August 1945. The sky above the Burmese plains was a dull, bruised gray. Rumors swirled through the camp like smoke. Japan had surrendered. The emperor's divine voice, a sound no common man had ever heard, had spoken the impossible words. The war was over. But inside the barbed wire, peace hadn't arrived yet. It was just another rumor, and rumors didn't stop bullets. For the prisoners, nothing changed. The guards were restless, caught between rage and relief. Some had lost brothers in the Pacific. Others just wanted to go home. But one thing was certain, hatred still needed somewhere to go. And for a man like Kenji Nakamura, that hatred found an easy target. It started small. A missing ration tin. A whispered accusation. The British corporal said he saw Kenji near the fence at night. Trying to escape, they claimed. Writing messages in code. The notebook, Emiko's notebook, sealed his fate. When Lieutenant Lister heard the report, he protested. You can't execute a man for this. The war's finished. But the camp commander, a worn-out officer named Davies, shook his head. Orders are orders until I'm told otherwise. If he's guilty, he dies. If he's not, he dies anyway. It'll keep the others quiet. That night, Lister walked to Kenji's cell. The prisoner was sitting in the corner, pale, his body barely holding together. In his lap was the same notebook, open to the last page. He had stopped writing. The pencil lay beside him, broken in half. Lister crouched beside him. Do you understand what's happening? Kenji looked up, eyes sunken but clear. Yes, he whispered. Tomorrow. Is there anything you want? Lister asked softly. Kenji hesitated, then slid the notebook forward. Send, Tokyo, to Emiko. Lister froze. He'd read that name 100 times and never understood it until now. It wasn't a code. It was love raw, unguarded, human. I'll try, Lister said, though he knew the odds. The next morning, the camp lined up before dawn. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant cries of crows. Kenji walked barefoot to the clearing. His uniform hung loose from his shoulders, his hair matted with sweat. In his hands, he clutched the notebook like a sacred relic. A firing squad waited, 6 men, rifles raised. Lister stood among the officers, his jaw tight. The commander's voice rang out. Private Kenji Nakamura, convicted of espionage and attempted escape. Sentence, death by firing squad. Kenji didn't flinch. He didn't plead. He only turned his head toward the rising sun. The wind carried the faint smell of rain. Lister took a step forward, unable to stop himself. Wait, he said. He's not. But the order came before he could finish. 6 shots cracked through the air. When the echoes died, Kenji's body lay still. The notebook had fallen open beside him, its pages fluttering in the wind like pale wings. The guards buried him in a shallow grave near the camp fence. No marker, no ceremony. Days later, official notice of Japan's surrender reached the camp. The war was indeed over. For most, it was a moment of disbelief, then exhaustion. But for Lister, it was something else, guilt. He couldn't forget the way Kenji had looked at him. That calm acceptance. That final word, Emiko. Weeks passed before the order came to dismantle the camp. As soldiers burned documents and destroyed supplies, Lister found himself wandering through the remains of the prisoner quarters. Amidst the ashes, he saw it, half buried in the mud, pages damp but still intact. The notebook. He picked it up, brushing off dirt and ash. Turning the pages, he saw what he had missed before. Between the lines of her name, faint sentences were hidden. Tiny, cramped writing that looked like whispers between the repetitions. Forgive me for leaving. I'm not brave. If you ever read this, know I was still yours. Each line was a confession, fragments of a man trying to leave behind something pure in a world gone mad. Lister sat down on a broken crate, rain pouring over his shoulders. For the first time, he felt the full weight of it, the tragedy not of soldiers or nations, but of individuals devoured by duty. He made a promise then. "I'll send it to her," he murmured. "I'll finish what he couldn't." Months later, after the war ended, a brown paper parcel arrived in Tokyo. Inside, it was a single notebook and a letter. It was found after the execution of Private Kenji Nakamura, Burma, 1945. He wanted you to have it. When Emiko opened the parcel, she recognized his handwriting instantly. Every page, her name. The same curves, the same strokes she had once watched him write when they shared tea by lantern light. Her hands trembled. She pressed the pages to her chest and wept, not for the man she had lost, but for the years he had spent loving her in silence. Outside, Tokyo was rebuilding, a city reborn from ash. But inside that small apartment, the war wasn't over. Not yet, because the words of a dead man had just come home. The decades passed quietly. Tokyo changed. The once charred ruins turned into neon towers. Streets that had echoed with air raid sirens now pulsed with the hum of traffic. Children who had hidden in basements grew up and built a new world on top of the ashes. But memory doesn't rebuild that easily. It hides, waiting for someone to open a box. In the spring of 1972, that box was opened again. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, lay the notebook. The ink had faded. The paper smelled of mildew and sea salt. Yet every page still whispered the same name, Emiko. A young historian named Dr. Haruko Ishii discovered it while cataloging wartime artifacts in the National Archives. "This is unusual," she murmured to a colleague. "No battle orders, no codes, just a name." When she traced the British tag tied to the notebook, she found a file of Private Kenji Nakamura, executed August 1945, Rangoon. Something about it haunted her. She began to dig. Old British military records, interrogation reports, the faded carbon copy of a letter signed by Lieutenant Mark Lister. A note in the margin. "Personal effects sent to Miss Emiko Tanaka, Tokyo, 1946. Haruko searched for her for months. Most who lived through that war preferred not to talk. But at last, an address surfaced, an elderly woman living alone near Yokohama. She was 81. When Haruko arrived, she found Emiko sitting by the window, the afternoon light painting her face in gold. On the table beside her rested the notebook, its corners frayed from years of being held. She ran her fingers over the cover. "You've read his story," she said softly, "but you can't smell it. Every page used to smell like the jungle." Haruko asked, "Did you ever write him back?" Emiko smiled faintly. "I tried, but they censored everything. The letters never left Japan." She opened to the final page. There, written faintly beneath the last Emiko, was a sentence no one had noticed before. "If the world forgets us, your name will remember me." For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Outside, cicadas buzzed. Inside, time stood still. That line, those words, captured the essence of what the war had erased. Identity. Humanity. Emotion. Millions of men like Kenji had vanished into anonymity, their stories left out of the official histories because they didn't fit the narrative of heroism or victory. But here it was, in fragile paper and trembling ink, proof that even inside a system built on obedience and death, the human heart had refused to die. Haruko asked permission to display the notebook in an upcoming exhibition called The Human Cost of Honor. Emiko hesitated. "He wrote it for me," she whispered. "But maybe now it belongs to everyone who lost someone they couldn't save." Months later, the notebook was placed in a glass case at the National Museum. People came by the thousands. Veterans, students, families. They stared at those endless rows of one name, Emiko, and fell silent. Some cried. Some just stood there, lost in thought. Newspapers called it the love that outlived the empire. One reporter asked Haruko, "Why do you think this story matters?" She answered simply, "Because he was supposed to disappear. And yet, here he is, still calling her name." In that answer lay the quiet truth the empire could never erase. Love endures where ideology fails. Memory defies power. Humanity survives even when nations don't. When Emiko passed away in 1976, the notebook was placed beside her in a small wooden box, not buried, but sealed in the family shrine. Every year since, her descendants open it during Obon, the Festival of the Dead, to read his handwriting aloud. 5 letters, over and over. EMIKO. No medals, no monuments, just ink and devotion. The world built from that war often forgets the soldiers who didn't die for glory, the ones who died remembering someone's face. But stories like Kenji's remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, there are still people, quietly writing love into the margins. Because remembrance isn't just memory, it's resistance. And somewhere, if you listen closely, you can still hear a faint whisper from another time. Emiko. The war ended, but their story never did. A single notebook outlived an empire, proof that memory can survive bullets, borders, and time itself. If Kenji and Emiko's voices reach you tonight, imagine how many others still wait, buried in attics and archives, for someone to read their names aloud. Subscribe, stay with us, and together we'll keep uncovering the hidden hearts of World War II, one forgotten story at a time.